The rain had been falling all afternoon, thin needles tapping against the cracked window of Isabella Hart's tiny apartment. The sound might have been soothing to someone else, but to her it was just a reminder of how fragile the walls around her life had become. Bills were stacked like bricks on the rickety table. Past due notices in red ink glared at her, as if daring her to hope. And in the small bedroom down the hall, her younger brother, Samuel, coughed in his sleep, his thin body twisted beneath worn blankets. Every rasp of his breath tore into her heart. She was only 21, but her shoulders already carried more weight than most people bore in a lifetime. She had never asked for rescue. Pride had kept her working nights at the diner, taking extra shifts at the bookstore, selling sketches on street corners when the landlord pressed for rent. But pride didn't pay hospital bills. Pride didn't buy medication. And as she stared at the newest notice from the bank, Isabella felt her courage fray. The world had become merciless, and she was one bad week away from collapse. The knock on her door startled her. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who expected to be obeyed. She hesitated, smoothing her worn sweater with trembling hands before pulling it open. A tall man stood there, dressed in black, his umbrella dripping onto the hallway floor. He was not a stranger, not really. Everyone in the city knew the name Damien Cross. Billionaire, real estate magnate, the man who bought and sold corporations like they were toys. His presence was electric, unsettling, as though he carried a storm inside him. "Miss Hart?" His voice was smooth but devoid of warmth. "Yes," she whispered, confused, her fingers tightening on the edge of the door. "I represent Mr. Cross," the man said, though his sharp eyes made her suspect he was Mr. Cross himself. "Fook. He has a proposition for you, one that could erase your debts and ensure your brother's treatment." Her breath caught. What kind of proposition? The stranger stepped inside without waiting for her to agree. He looked around the tiny apartment with detached curiosity, as though cataloging its poverty. His gaze landed on the stack of bills, on the faint cough drifting from Samuel's room. Finally, he turned back to her. "He requires an heir," the man said simply, as though discussing a business merger. "And he has chosen you." The words struck her like a blow. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. Chosen her? She, who had never been on a date, who had never known the warmth of a man's embrace, who carried her innocence like an awkward secret? "You mean, you want me to?" Her voice trailed off, strangled by disbelief. He nodded once, sharply. "In exchange, every debt you carry will vanish. Your brother's medical expenses will be covered. You will never struggle again." Her hands trembled. The room seemed smaller, the air thinner. She wanted to scream at him, to throw him out, and yet the image of Samuel lying pale and feverish anchored her to the spot. She thought of the doctors who had turned her away, of the endless doors that had closed in her face. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice cracking. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. "Because you're untouched. Because you're untainted by the world I live in." The bluntness of it made her flinch. Shame flooded her cheeks, yet beneath it a strange current stirred. Fear, yes, but also a dangerous spark of something she couldn't name. Damien Cross was a man carved from ice, his reputation one of ruthless control. He never let emotion interfere with business, yet as he studied the fragile young woman before him, her wide, uncertain eyes, her trembling defiance, something cracked in the mask he wore. He felt it, sudden and unwelcome, a spark that shouldn't have existed. And Isabella, though she didn't yet understand it, had just stepped into a world where her innocence would collide with his shadows, where a single night would change everything. The city looked different through the tinted glass of Damien's limousine. Isabella sat stiffly on the leather seat, her hands clenched in her lap as though afraid to touch anything around her. The glittering skyline blurred past, towers of glass and steel that seemed to mock the cracked walls of her apartment. Every hum of the engine pulled her farther from the life she knew and deeper into a world she did not understand. Damien sat across from her, silent, unreadable. His presence filled the space more than the car itself. His dark eyes flicked toward her now and then, but he said nothing, as though waiting to see how long it would take before she broke the silence. Isabella tried not to meet his gaze, but the weight of it pressed on her like a storm cloud. When the car stopped before an enormous black iron gate, her breath hitched. The gates opened without a word from him, and the vehicle slid forward into the grounds of a mansion that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The driveway curved beneath rows of marble pillars, and fountains glittered with water lit from beneath. Isabella pressed her hands against the seat to steady herself. This was a world of power, and she was stepping into it with nothing but her innocence and desperation. Inside, the mansion was colder than the rain outside. Floors gleamed with polished stone, chandeliers dripped with crystal light, and portraits of severe men and elegant women watched her from gilded frames. The staff moved like shadows, their eyes lowered, their silence unnerving. Isabella's footsteps echoed too loudly in the vast hall as Damien led her deeper inside. Finally, he stopped at a heavy oak door. He opened it with a push rev, hailing a room that smelled faintly of old leather and firewood. Bookshelves lined the walls, a fire burned in a grand hearth, and at the center stood a desk that seemed to stretch across half the room. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her heartbeat loud in her ears. On the desk lay a folder. Damien slid it toward her. The pages inside were filled with words she barely understood, clauses, obligations, promises sealed with signatures. The contract. Her throat went dry as her eyes skimmed the lines. In exchange for bearing his child, every medical bill, every debt, every financial nightmare strangling her life would vanish. Isabella looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why not anyone else?" He leaned forward, his hands folded, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Because you are untouched, because you are pure, and because I trust no one in my world." The fire crackled between them. Isabella felt the weight of his words sink into her skin. She had been chosen not for who she was, but for what she represented, innocence in a life poisoned by greed and betrayal. She should have been angry. Instead, she felt a strange shiver, as though a lock inside her had been forced open. But beneath Damien's control lay something else. Something she caught in the way his jaw tightened when she hesitated over the page. He was ruthless, yes, but there was a flicker of fear, too. Fear of time running out. Fear of losing something she could not yet see. Her hand shook as she lifted the pen. Samuel's pale face filled her mind, his weak smile, his whispered pleas not to give up. With a breath that felt like surrender, Isabella pressed the pen to paper. Damien's eyes did not leave her as she signed. When the ink dried, he closed the folder with a snap, sealing her fate. "You belong to my world now," he said softly, "and whether you realize it or not, you have just changed everything." The night hung heavy over the mansion, silence pressing against the windows like another secret waiting to be spoken. Isabella sat at the edge of a grand bed that did not feel like it belonged to her, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress until her knuckles turned white. The contract was signed, her fate sealed, yet the reality of what she had agreed to had only now begun to crush her. Her heart pounded as though it wanted to escape her chest, her breaths shallow and uneven. The door opened without warning. Damien entered, his footsteps slow, deliberate, the sound echoing in the vast room. He wore no jacket now, only a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the faint glint of his watch catching the dim light. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire she had seen earlier, and more like a man stripped down to something rawer, more dangerous. His gaze fell on her, steady and unreadable, and the air seemed to thin. "You are trembling," he said at last, his voice deep but not unkind. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him she was afraid, that she had never been touched, that everything about this was wrong. But Samuel's face rose in her mind again, frail and fading, and her courage failed her. Damien stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his hand lifted, not to claim her as she had braced for, but to brush back a loose strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek. The gesture was gentle, so at odds with his reputation that she froze in disbelief. He studied her face for a long moment, as though searching for something hidden beneath her fear. "You have never known this before, have you?" His words were more observation than question. Isabella's eyes widened, her lips parting, but she could not lie. She shook her head, her cheeks burning. Something shifted in his expression then, something she had never imagined, seeing in him a flicker of hesitation, of restraint. He sat down beside her on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking beneath his weight, his presence overwhelming her senses. Yet he did not touch her again. Instead, his voice softened, carrying a note she had never expected. "I thought this would be simple, an arrangement, a transaction. But now I see nothing about you as simple." Her breath caught at the confession. The man who commanded empires, who reduced boardrooms to silence with a glance, was confessing uncertainty to her. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the firelight from the hearth painting his features in shifting gold and shadow. She whispered that she was afraid. The words cracked in the stillness. For the first time, Damien's control faltered. His hand reached for hers, covering it with a warmth that startled her. "Do not fear me, Isabella. I will not take what you are not ready to give." The promise unsettled her more than the threat ever could, because in his restraint, she glimpsed something dangerous, something she had not been prepared for. Humanity. Desire that was not born of control, but of something deeper, something he seemed almost afraid to admit. And in that moment, Isabella realized the night would not unfold as she had imagined. It would not be cold and mechanical. Something had already begun to unravel inside him, and in her innocence, she had stirred it. A spark neither of them could put out. Morning light crept through the tall windows of the mansion, spilling across polished marble floors and whispering against heavy velvet curtains. Isabella moved quietly through the hallways, her steps soft, her eyes wide as she tried to absorb this world she had been pulled into. The night before lingered in her memory, not with the terror she had expected, but with a strange confusion. Damien had not claimed her the way she had braced for. He had touched her gently, spoken with restraint, and then left her in the silence of her own thoughts. That small act of mercy unsettled her more than anything else. The staff moved like shadows around her, silent and efficient, but she felt their eyes on her. Whispers followed her steps. She was not like the other women who had passed through this place. Women who left with diamonds and stories of Damien's cold distance. Isabella felt the tension in their glances, the way their conversations hushed when she entered the room. Why her? Why had he brought her into the heart of his fortress when he kept everyone else out? She wandered into the garden, where fountains danced in the morning sun, and roses bloomed in careful perfection. It was beautiful, yet the air carried a weight, as though the very stones of the mansion held secrets. Her fingers brushed the petals of a white rose, delicate and fragile, when she heard footsteps behind her. Damien appeared, his presence cutting through the morning calm. He wore a dark suit, his tie loose as though he had discarded the perfection the world demanded of him. His gaze softened when it landed on her, though his voice carried its usual steel. "You should not walk alone. This house is large. You could get lost." "I am already lost," she answered, before she could stop herself. The words slipped from her lips like truth pulled from her soul. His eyes darkened at her honesty, and for a heartbeat, he thought she saw something crack behind his walls. He stepped closer, his shadow mingling with hers. The staff in the distance paused, watching. Damien ignored them. He reached for the rose she had touched, plucked it with ease, and handed it to her. His hand lingered against hers, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her knees tremble. "You do not belong to this world," he said quietly, "and yet you are here. And now I cannot decide if that will destroy me or save me." The words burned into her chest. No man had ever looked at her that way, as though she was both danger and salvation. She clutched the rose, her fingers trembling, her heart racing with emotions she could not name. Behind them, whispers stirred again. The butler exchanged a glance with a maid, a silent acknowledgement of what they had seen. Damien Cross, the man of ice, had allowed someone into his private wing, into his garden of secrets. And not just anyone, a girl who had walked into his world with nothing but her innocence and desperation. Isabella felt it then, deep in her bones. Something was shifting, not just in her life, but in Damien himself. The contract that bound them was no longer just paper. It was becoming something dangerous, something fragile, something that could shatter both of them if they dared to follow it. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows of the mansion that night, thunder rolling across the sky as if echoing the storm building between them. Isabella sat in the library, curled into a chair with an old book resting in her lap, though she had not turned a page in an hour. Her thoughts were tangled with memories of Damien's gaze, of the rose he had placed in her hand, of the strange tenderness that had cut through his ruthless mask. She wanted to hate him for what he had forced upon her, yet something inside her betrayed her. She wanted to understand him. She wanted to know why a man who could have chosen anyone in the world had chosen her. The door opened, and she lifted her eyes to find him standing there. Damien's suit was damp from the rain, his dark hair disheveled, his presence filling the room like a storm in human form. He looked tired, as if the weight of unseen battles pressed on him, yet his gaze softened the moment it found her. "You should not sit alone on nights like this," he said quietly. Isabella closed the book, clutching it to her chest. "I am used to being alone," she answered. It was the truth, but her voice betrayed her longing. For years, she had carried her burdens in silence, never daring to hope someone might share them. Damien walked closer, the firelight throwing shadows across his face. For the first time, he seemed less untouchable, more human, and that unsettled her more than his power ever had. He stopped beside her chair, his hand brushing the back of it as if fighting the urge to reach for her. "I told myself I would keep this only as an arrangement," he murmured. "But every time I see you, I begin to doubt if I can keep that promise." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but before she could speak, a sharp crack of thunder rattled the windows. She flinched, and instinctively Damien's hand covered hers, steady and warm. His touch was protective, not demanding, and in that moment she felt the truth pressing between them. He was no longer the cold negotiator of contracts. He was a man unraveling. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hall broke the moment. One of the maids appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide with unease. "Forgive me, sir, but the newspapers have printed something. The staff are whispering it already." Damien's jaw tightened as he took the folded paper from her trembling hands. He read the headline once, then crushed the paper in his fist, his eyes flashing with rage. Isabella's stomach twisted. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice fragile. He turned to her, his voice sharp but not unkind. "They are calling you a fraud, a girl who sold herself to me for wealth. They know about the contract." The room spun around her. Her face drained of color as shame and fear washed over her. Every word of gossip, every whisper from the staff, had been given life in print. She wanted to disappear into the floor, to run from the mansion and never look back. Damien stepped closer, his fury not at her, but at the world daring to touch her. "Do not believe them," he said fiercely. His hand lifted, cupping her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are not what they say, and I will not allow them to destroy you." For a man who lived by walls and iron rules, it was a dangerous promise. But Isabella saw it in his eyes. He meant every word, and in the thunder-lit silence, she realized something that made her heart pound with both terror and longing. Damien Cross was beginning to break his own chains for her. The storm outside the mansion had passed, but a darker storm was raging beyond its gates. Isabella sat in the drawing room, the morning sun spilling across her pale face as she clutched the newspaper Damien had left on the table. Her own image stared back at her from the front page, captured as she stepped out of his car, her eyes lowered, her posture timid. The headline screamed of scandal, painting her as nothing more than a desperate girl who had sold herself to a billionaire's cold ambition. Her fingers trembled over the ink. She could almost hear the voices of strangers echoing through the streets, mocking her, judging her. Shame burned her skin, but beneath it lay a sharper wound. The thought that Damien might believe the same, that deep down he saw her as nothing but the transaction they had signed. The door swung open, and Damien strode in, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp, commanding, every word like a blade. "Shut it down. Pull the story from every outlet. I don't care what it costs." I said shut it down. He ended the call with a snap, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard with fury. She rose slowly, the newspaper clutched in her hand. "They are right, aren't they?" she whispered. "This is what I agreed to bear your child for money." Her voice cracked on the last word, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Damien's expression shifted. He crossed the room in 2 strides, ripping the paper from her grasp and hurling it into the fire. Flames devoured her shame, but the heat could not erase the ache in her chest. "Do not reduce yourself to their lies," he said, his voice low but seething with intensity. "They want to break you because you are with me." "But why me?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "Why not someone else? Why drag me into a world that tears me apart before I even know how to stand in it?" His silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, before he finally answered. "Because you are not like them, because you are the only one untouched by greed and poison, because when I look at you, I see the one thing I cannot control." Her heart stumbled at his words, but fear still clawed at her. Before she could speak, another storm arrived at the door. Damien's ex-fiancée, elegant and sharp as a blade, swept into the mansion without permission. Her heels struck the marble like gunfire, her lips curved in a cruel smile. "So this is the girl," she sneered. "The innocent little lamb the great Damien Cross has chosen to ruin." She circled Isabella like a predator, her perfume suffocating, her voice dripping venom. "You really thought you could survive in his world? You are nothing but a scandal wrapped in borrowed silk." Isabella stood frozen, shame crashing over her, but before the words could crush her, Damien stepped forward. His arm went around Isabella, pulling her against him. His voice was lethal when he spoke. "Leave. Now." The woman's smile faltered at the steel in his tone, but she recovered quickly, tossing her head with a mocking laugh. "Careful, Damien. If you let your heart get in the way, you'll lose more than your empire." When she was gone, silence filled the room, broken only by Isabella's ragged breathing. She looked up at Damien, his arms still firm around her, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. For the first time, he was no longer just her captor in this contract. He was her shield. But with that protection came something more dangerous, something she felt pulsing beneath his control. Damien Cross was no longer fighting to protect his empire. He was fighting to protect her, and that fight would soon cost them both more than either could imagine. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers and golden light, the air thick with perfume and whispers. Every corner shimmered with wealth and power, but beneath the glittering masks of high society lurked sharper weapons: gossip, scandal, betrayal. Isabella clung to the edge of Damien's arm as they entered, her gown borrowed from his world of luxury, her posture stiff beneath the gaze of hundreds of strangers. She felt their eyes slicing into her, their smiles brittle, their whispers sharper than knives. Damien's grip was firm, commanding, as though daring anyone to challenge her presence. Yet the weight of the night pressed harder with every step. She did not belong here, and every woman's smirk, every man's mocking glance reminded her of it. The music swelled, a waltz filling the grand hall, but all Isabella heard was the pounding of her own heart. At first, the evening unfolded in shallow rituals: handshakes, polite laughter, conversations laced with poison. Damien stood tall, untouchable, his voice steady as he maneuvered through the crowd. But Isabella felt the danger circling, invisible but undeniable, like a storm waiting to break. It came in the form of a woman draped in crimson silk, her beauty sharp, her smile lethal. Damien's former fiancée moved with practiced grace, the room parting for her as though she were royalty. She approached, her eyes locking on Isabella with predatory delight. "What a lovely little arrangement," she purred loud enough for the crowd to hear. The whispers began instantly, rippling through the ballroom. "Did he tell you, my dear?" She tilted her head at Isabella, her voice honeyed but cruel. "Did he tell you that you were chosen by contract, that your innocence was purchased like a business deal?" Gasps filled the air. The music faltered. All eyes turned to Isabella, wide with shock, hungry for scandal. Her body stiffened, her breath catching Leah's key glass in her throat. She looked at Damien, praying for him to deny it, to shatter the accusation. But Damien's silence cut deeper than any word. His jaw tightened, his eyes cold, but he said nothing. The room erupted with whispers, cruel laughter, judgment. Isabella's heart splintered under the weight of it. The truth, the secret she had carried in shame, now exposed before the world. Her vision blurred. She felt the walls of the ballroom closing in, the chandeliers spinning above her. In that moment, she understood. To Damien, she was still the contract, the girl chosen for purity, for convenience, for his empire. Not the woman he had begun to hold in the quiet, not the soul he had touched with unexpected tenderness. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper, but he heard it. "You said I had changed everything, yet you still see me as nothing." She pulled away, her steps unsteady as she fled through the glittering crowd. Whispers trailed after her like claws. Damien reached for her, but his hesitation cost him. She was gone before his hand could catch her, swallowed by the night beyond the ballroom doors. The music resumed, brittle and false, but Damien stood frozen, the weight of his silence pressing down like a chain. For the first time in years, the man who commanded empires realized he was powerless. He had not only lost control of the night, he had lost her. Rain poured over the city like 1,000 unspoken secrets, drenching the streets and blurring the glow of passing headlights. Isabella ran blindly through the storm, her gown heavy with water, her tears indistinguishable from the rain on her face. Every whisper from the ballroom echoed in her mind, every cruel laugh slicing her open. She had given up everything for this arrangement, sacrificed her pride for her brother's survival, and still she was nothing more than a scandal to the world and a contract to Damien. Her heels slipped on the slick pavement, but she did not stop. She needed air, space, freedom from the chains of his empire. She wanted to believe his tenderness, to trust the rare moments where his eyes had softened, but tonight his silence had spoken louder than any lie. Behind her, Damien's car skidded to a halt, the black machine cutting through the downpour. He stepped into the storm without hesitation, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his suit clinging to him as he searched the street. Isabella froze for only a moment before turning to run again, but his voice stopped her. "Isabella, stop." His command was sharp, the kind that usually froze boardrooms into silence, but this time it cracked with something raw. She turned slowly, her breath ragged, her arms wrapped around herself as if to shield her from him. Her voice trembled. "Why didn't you deny it? Why did you let them shame me in front of everyone?" Damien's chest heaved, his pride collapsing under the weight of her broken voice. "Because if I denied it, they would only dig deeper, and I could not protect you from the truth." His words faltered, his eyes burning with desperation. "I thought keeping silent was strength, but in that moment, my silence was the greatest betrayal I have ever committed." He stepped closer, the storm raging around them, until he was only inches away. His hand lay, lifted, hesitated, then fell to his side. His voice dropped, hoarse with the weight of unspoken years. "I was supposed to use you. That was the plan, to secure my future, to protect my empire. But the moment I saw you trembling in that chair, too innocent for the world I live in, everything changed." Isabella shook her head, tears spilling freely. "You only see me as a contract, a womb for your heir." "No." His voice cracked, louder than the thunder that rolled above them. "I see you as the only thing in my life that has ever been real. You are not my contract, Isabella. You are the air in my lungs, the reason my heart still beats." And then, the man who had never bowed to anyone, the man who made the world bend to his will, dropped to his knees in the middle of the storm, his suit soaked, his hands pressed against the wet pavement, his eyes locked on hers with a fire she had never seen before. "Marry me, not because of the contract, not because of my empire. Marry me because without you, I am nothing." The world stilled around her. Cars passed, the rain fell, thunder roared, but all she saw was him on his knees, stripped of every shield, every mask, the ruthless billionaire undone by the very woman he had once intended to use. Her heart ached with disbelief, torn between the wounds of betrayal and the desperate truth in his eyes. For the first time, she realized Damien Cross was no longer fighting for his empire. He was fighting for her. The storm had calmed by morning, but the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Isabella sat by the window of a small inn where she had taken refuge, staring at the gray clouds as if they might hold the answers she could not find. Damien's words from the night before still echoed in her chest. Marry me. Not for the contract, not for the empire, for me. She wanted to believe him, but doubts wrapped around her heart like iron chains. His silence at the gala still bled into her thoughts. Could a man who built his world on power truly choose love over ambition? The door burst open and Damien entered, his hair damp, his suit creased from hours of searching. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire and more like a man frayed to the edge. Isabella rose slowly, her voice shaking. You should not be here. I had no choice, he said, his tone heavy with urgency. Because if I do not tell you everything now, I will lose you forever. Her chest tightened, fear and hope colliding. Tell me what? Damien stepped closer, his eyes dark, his jaw tight. My father is dying. The empire that bears my name is at risk of falling into the hands of my stepbrother, a man who would bleed it dry. The board has given me one condition to secure my legacy. I must produce an heir. That is why I sought you. That is why the contract was written. Isabella staggered back as the truth struck her. So it was never about me. It was never about anything but saving your empire. Her voice broke, anger burning through her tears. No, Damien's voice cut through the air, raw and fierce. It began that way, yes. I needed you to protect what I had built, but I did not expect you to become the only thing worth protecting. Her heart ached, but the wound was deep. You lied to me. Every moment, every word, it was all built on a secret you kept. His fists clenched at his sides, his control slipping. I lied, because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would walk away before I could prove that I am more than my empire. A silence stretched between them, sharp and fragile. Isabella turned her gaze to the window, rain beginning to streak the glass once more. She whispered, almost to herself, I cannot raise a child in lies. Damien moved closer, desperation carving lines into his face. Then let there be no lies. I will sign everything away. The company, the inheritance, the empire. It means nothing if it costs me you. Her eyes widened, her breath catching as she turned back to him. You would give up billions, power, everything. His voice steadied, quiet but unshakable. I would give up eternity itself if it meant keeping you by my side. For a moment, the storm inside her heart paused. The ruthless man she had feared now stood before her stripped of armor, offering her more than any contract ever could. But the choice was hers, and the weight of it pressed down like a blade. And then, as if the world itself refused to let them decide in peace, a sharp knock rattled the door. A messenger stood there, soaked by the rain, a sealed envelope in hand. Isabella took it, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. Inside was a letter signed by Damien's stepbrother, a warning laced with poison. If you walk away from the empire, Isabella will pay the price. The truth had come crashing into the open. Damien's battle was no longer just for his empire. It was for her life. The storm outside raged with a fury that seemed to mirror the chaos inside Damien's heart. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed in the inn, the letter from his stepbrother still trembling in her hands. Her face was pale, her body tense, but her eyes burned with determination. Damien paced the room like a caged lion, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. He had spent his life controlling every deal, every secret, every empire that bent beneath his name. But now he faced the one battle he could not fight with contracts or wealth. You should have told me earlier, she whispered, her voice raw with hurt. If you had trusted me, I would not feel like this. His steps faltered. He turned to her, his expression cracking with pain. Isabella, I was a coward. I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you would leave. And now I see that by hiding it, I have only pushed you farther away. She stood slowly, her hand resting on her stomach. You were willing to make me a pawn in your war with your family. I gave you my innocence, my trust, and still you hid behind your empire. Before Damien could respond, she gasped and doubled over, pain slicing through her body. His world stopped. Isabella. He rushed to her side, catching her as her knees buckled. It's too soon. Her voice trembled, her breaths shallow. Damien scooped her into his arms, his fear raw and unrestrained as he carried her through the storm to the car. At the hospital, the sterile lights and hurried footsteps blurred around him. Doctors swarmed Isabella, pushing him aside, but Damien refused to move. He held her hand as she cried out, his grip fierce, his eyes locked on hers. Stay with me, Isabella, please stay with me. For the first time, his voice cracked like glass and his mask shattered completely. Hours felt like lifetimes. Then the cry of a newborn pierced the air. Damien's chest seized as tears burned his eyes. The doctor placed the tiny C, held in Isabella's arms, her face glowing with exhaustion and awe. She is perfect, Isabella whispered, her lips trembling. Damien stared at the fragile life they had created, something no contract could ever bind or buy. But the moment was shattered by the arrival of his stepbrother, his figure looming in the doorway, his voice like poison. You've won nothing, Damien. Walk away from the Empire and you lose everything. Stay and you lose her. Damien rose, his body trembling with fury. For years he had fought to control every battle, to guard every piece of his empire. But in that instant, the choice was clear. He tore the envelope from his stepbrother's hand, ripped it in half, and let the pieces fall to the floor. Take the empire. Take the billions. I no longer need it. His stepbrother's face twisted with shock. You would throw away everything for her. Damien's voice was steady, his gaze locked on Isabella and the child in her arms. She is my everything. The stepbrother left in stunned silence, defeated not by contracts or boardroom victories, but by a man who had finally chosen love over power. Damien returned to Isabella, his knees sinking beside her bed. His hand brushed the baby's cheek before rising to cup Isabella's face. No more lies, no more contracts. I am not asking you to bear my heir. I am asking you to be my life. Isabella's tears flowed freely, her heart breaking open at the raw truth in his eyes. You would give up your empire for me? I already have, he whispered. She reached for him, pulling him into her arms, their child cradled between them. In that moment, the storm outside quieted, as if the world itself bowed to their choice. Weeks later, the empire belonged to another. The headlines had moved on, but in a quiet home far from marble floors and crystal chandeliers, Damien Cross held his wife and child with more pride than any fortune could bring. The man who had once lived for power now lived for love, and in the soft light of dawn, Isabella finally believed the promise he had made. There were no contracts, no conditions, no empire to divide them. There was only forever,